Hello and welcome back to session 6 of Decolonising the Body, the 2021 Decolonial Summer School Programme. So this week's topic for discussion is ritual, spirituality and religion. These are not areas that I have a great deal of expertise, so in this recording what I'll do is try and give you a bit of a decolonial analytical frame for how we might approach these questions. First of all, let me say something about the mind-body split again. As I referred to back at the beginning of this course, the mind-body split has been a foundational principle of dominant Western philosophy since the Enlightenment. And the idea of this mind-body split wasn't just that we could separate bodies from minds, but that there was a hierarchy between them. So the body being the sort of limits of lived experience, the mind being the capacity to escape those limits and through objectivity and reason to access truths about the world. And this accessing of truths has been deemed to be the way in which we should go about producing knowledge, but also how we should structure our ideas about politics and about society. As I've said in various weeks, this separation of mind and body is not only a hierarchy between mind and body, but actually mapped onto hierarchies between different peoples. So there was an assumption that certain types of people were necessarily limited to their bodies. And in fact, Anukuvi gave a very good example of this in the discussion in last week's session when he spoke about the Bodhyar system and the ways in which there is a separation between the landlord, the landowner, who is assumed to be the educated or the person who is capable of education and the mind, and the body of the landless peasant, who is the worker, who is only ever reduced to the labor of their bodies. This hierarchization of different groups of people according to whether they are perceived to be engaged purely at the level of body or capable of accessing the mind stretches across many different fields. And what I want us to do today is think about what the process of ritual invokes in relation to this mind-body split. So what does ritual mean? Actually, if you just take a sort of literal understanding of the term ritual in English, it speaks about a sort of unconscious practice, just things that we do as human beings. It doesn't always have to be in the sense of some kind of spiritual practice. Rituals are the rituals we engage in every morning when we brush our teeth, eat our breakfast, get dressed and go to work. But the assumption is always that this is something that is just done, physically done, but not necessarily something that has some kind of higher level of thought associated. I think this sense of ritual is important when we think about the ways in which many practices in different parts of the colonized world became identified as rituals in colonial writing. So we can think about this, and I'm sure many of you will have examples of various ritual practices within your own communities that have been written about in this sense. What this allowed colonizers to do was to split the world between the world of rationality, the public sphere, civil society, which was a world of ideas and engagement and thinking, and this other space that was pre-modern, cultural, traditional, but that was all about unconscious practice. For subaltern studies scholars, this poses a really interesting question. One of the ways in which that is used to explain and justify why certain people are just never seen to be the producers of knowledge or are never seen as capable of accessing the full rights of citizenship and political agency. And this, as subaltern studies scholars have demonstrated, was not just something that Europeans said about colonized people, but was also something that in anti-colonial movements and in post-colonial nations has been reproduced between the elites in a society, who are the educated ones, and the rest of the population that is often deemed sort of just bodies. And this is well captured in the work of Partha Chatterjee, for example, when he describes post-colonial India and the separation between bourgeois citizens and what he calls political society, which is the vast majority of the Indian population that is always assumed to be requiring some kind of intervention, positive or negative, but that are never seen to be political agents in their own right. As a result, subaltern studies scholars have urged us to think about whether or not we might approach the ritual or other practices of the subaltern not from the point of view of trying to recuperate them and bring them into the processes of rationality and objectivity and modernity, but to actually look at how those other spaces might show us the limits of these ideas of rationality and objectivity and the importance that they hold to questions of the political. So one person who's written about this in interesting ways, I think, is the subaltern studies scholar Dipesh Chakrabatty. In his book, Provincializing Europe, he asks the question of how can we fully understand the experience of humans without also grappling with the reality of gods, spirits, and supernatural beings? What does he mean by this? He doesn't enter into a discussion about whether these gods, spirits, and supernatural beings really exist or not in this world. That's not really what he cares about. What he cares about more is that even those of us who have been sympathetic to the plight of different marginalized and excluded groups have often felt a need to discount or to explain away these extra human factors. We've had to try and rationalize them in some way in order to bring the subaltern into the category of modern history, modern political subjectivity. What Chakrabatty argues is that actually maybe we need to rather than try and make sense of these practices, and he describes, for example, practices of weavers in Bengal who perform particular rituals and pujas around the process of weaving, that rather than trying to tell a story of how, this is a way in which workers soothe themselves in harsh conditions, or it's a way in which they entertain themselves as they go about their labor, then actually maybe it just demonstrates the limits of our understanding of what labor actually is. And what Chakrabatty is taking up there is the ways in which, for example, many subaltern studies and other post-colonial thinkers have been very influenced by Marxism. But for Marx, the idea of labor takes on a universal meaning. It has to mean the same everywhere. Whereas what Chakrabatty is arguing is that maybe labor doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. And maybe for these particular weavers, the labor of performing a ritual for a particular god is as much a part of what it means to be a laboring body as the labor of working in a factory. So what does this present to us? Well, I think it presents a really interesting and important way in which we might question the limits of existing knowledge systems to say, as I said in my introduction to the decolonial, that the existing frames of knowledge we have tried to suppress these other knowledges because they don't fit within the logic of the dominant knowledge. But they've never completely erased those other knowledges. They have downgraded them or pushed them to the margins. But actually, maybe for the decolonial project, part of what we need to do is to reclaim those other knowledges in all of the richness of their own logics, not try and integrate their logics into our own logic. The ways in which I think this might be interesting for us to think, and this is something I've tried to write a little bit about in the context of Sri Lanka, is how do ritual spaces provide a political space or a space for engagement with bigger questions in the lives of different subaltern groups that are actually not available to them within formal institutions, within dominant civil society spaces. And if we think like that, how might we then revalorize the ritual, not just as a ritual that, deserves respect because that's what people choose to participate in, but also maybe as an important imaginative and political space. Having said this, I think it's very important when we talk like this about ritual that we also don't lose sight of the need to engage critically with ritual. As many of you have spoken about, it's not that the space of the ritual is a space that is completely equal and free of processes of domination. And indeed, Eva in her own work, Karthi in research that she's done, have demonstrated the ways in which, for example, women's labour is used to maintain temples, to look after gods and goddesses, and yet when it comes to who is deemed capable of speaking to the goddess or who should be entitled to access certain areas of temples, they have still been the domain of men. There are also, of course, ways in which caste hierarchies have been used to justify why some people are allowed to participate in the ritual, for example, drummers, but they are still seen as having a lesser status than other castes who are seen as the purer or person who can engage the gods in a different way. So these relationships of domination are not just something that happens between, a sort of secular Western modernity and ritual, but they're also enshrined within the ritual space. So if we recognize this, we need to say that on the one hand, there might be a way that we engage ritual as something that extends our possibilities of thinking about politics, about agency, about what it means to be human, but at the same time that process has to be done through critical analysis, not critical analysis that imposes an existing framework, secularism or modernity, onto the ritual, but rather tries to explore within the space of the ritual what are the struggles that are existing in that space between different actors. And that's what I'm hoping that this week we will get a chance to speak more about.